8 young friends set out for a simple summer picnic near an old mine in 1993. For 15 years, their families were told they had simply vanished without a trace. But when the mine was finally reopened, the truth hidden inside was more horrifying than anyone imagined. In the picture, they looked like the kind of kids you trust to bring casseroles to a funeral and return your Tupperware without being asked. 8 of them, knees touching on a faded quilt, sunlight throwing coins into their hair, the sort of photo that ends up tucked into a frame with a graduation tassel because nothing bad ever happens to faces that open and honest. It was taken on a Saturday in late June 1993. On the low hill above Iron Creek, where the old ore road flattens before the last bend. Someone, probably Noah, set the point and shoot on its tiny tripod and hit the timer, and that was that. 1 shutter click, 8 smiles, the last proof Miller Hollow ever had that the day began simple. They were small town, bright and restless, in different ways. Noah Whitcomb. 20, had hands nicked by the grocery store meat counter and a head full of maps. His sister, Sarah, 19, was the kind whose teachers saved the essays to read again when the room was empty. Ethan Crowell, the one with the relaxed boy-next-door grin, worked day shifts at the feed mill and did night classes at the community college. His girlfriend, Lila Goodwin, had a St. Christopher medallion she thumbed when the road curved. Tory Lane, engaged at 19 and already the steady one, could wrap a sprained ankle with her eyes shut. Benji Cross wore his ball cap too tight and made everyone laugh when talks got heavy. Denise Mercado was the first in her family headed to a 4-year school. Cade Ransom had a racket fixing neighbors' lawnmowers with coffee can. Parts. They had been friends all through church suppers and football seasons, some of them closer than others. 2 couples, a pair of siblings, and 2 who orbited everyone else because some people always do. That afternoon, they'd spent their tips on egg salad and grape soda at Hanson's Market, because Hanson still wrote the total on paper and tucked change in your palm like a secret. They ate by the creek, feet in the water, while the older men at the next table at Cheer the Spur talked about the old mine the way you talk about relatives who drink, fond once but not to be trusted now. The mine's name had changed over the decades as owners came and went, but the valley stuck with the one it was born with. Redbird. The danger sign at the portal was older than the oldest kid at the high school. It wasn't that the 8 planned to go inside. That's what their mothers would cling to afterward, because that made a better sentence to hold in your mouth at church. They hadn't meant to be foolish. They were just going to walk to the timbered mouth, see the rails slipping into dark. Like 2 lines you could stand astride, take a look, go home, tell the story of how cold the breath of a mountain can be even on a 90-degree day. Denise wanted a photo of the entrance with the hand-painted sign. Noah liked to mark old places on the map in his glove box. Lila wanted to hear the way her laugh sounded in that kind of echo. By 3 o'clock, they were parked at the pull-off, and cars pointed out so nobody had to back up on the ore road later. A rancher named J.D. McKendryson slowed his truck long enough to say, "Watch your step up there," and Ethan lifted a hand to show he'd heard. J.D. would repeat that fact, to himself and to others, until the day he died, the way you worry a loose tooth. They hiked the last quarter mile. Dust kicked up in puffs around their shoes. Grasshoppers shot from the brush like misfired sparklers. The portal didn't look dramatic the way people imagine a mine does. It looked tired. 2 weather-silvered posts, a wasted lintel, rails that had rusted to the same color as the rocks that had birthed them. The danger sign leaned crooked, corner buried in cheatgrass. A padlock hung on a waist-high chain across the opening, more symbolic than secure. 15 minutes, Tori said. In the shade and back out. We promised. Nobody argued, because Tori was the sort you don't argue with when it's about safety. She had a way of saying the practical thing without turning into a scold. They stood at the mouth and let the cool curl around their ankles. Denise took the picture. She wanted Deadwood style. The entrance square behind their shoulders, rails like a pair of parentheses. Noah slid a handlight from his pack, one of the big square ones you charged on a kitchen counter in the 90s, and ran the beam along the timbers, then into the first 10 feet, a small act like testing bathwater with a toe. The air smelled like wet pennies and old wood. Ethan squinted. "Hear that?" he asked, head cocked. "Bats," Lila guessed. "Wind," Noah said, but he didn't like the way it didn't sound like either. They stayed where the sun still found them. Sarah picked a bit of faded orange tape off a sage stem and tied it to the chain in a sailor's knot, because her father had taught her to mark her way even when she didn't plan to go far. Benji threw a pebble down the drift and grinned when it clicked somewhere you couldn't see. "That's enough," Tori decided, clapping her hands once the way daycare workers do to change gears, and that was that. They walked back to the cars. Sarah turned once to look, because some people always do. If any of the 8 had had an enemy in town, if anyone had owed anyone money, or made a loud scene at the Hightails on Friday, the case would have begun a different way. But there was no ready villain, no tidy story. They were good kids. Their parents were ordinary, accounts payable at the mill, a library clerk, a man with a shoulder ruined by the last downturn at Redbird. Supper time came and no kids. 8 sets of parents made 8 rounds of calls. By 9 o'clock, Sheriff Walt Eddington was standing by the pull-off with a maglite and a mouthful of dust, looking at a patch of dirt that told him nothing a human eye could trust. The first search was the kind you always get when a town believes in common sense. Deputies and volunteers worked the shoulders of the ore road, calling names like they were out hunting for beagles who'd wriggled a fence. The mine mouth was inspected, not entered. Sheriff Eddington borrowed a gas meter from the county shop because the valley had one, and you could sign it out if you knew the man with the clipboard. The needle flicked into a range the state later called uncomfortable, and the rescue. Draft plans stayed clipped inside a desk. By morning, word had traveled. The hollow by the creek filled with lawn chairs and coolers, and the careful buzz of neighbors bringing the right amount of food, which is how grief tries to keep its hands busy. A rescue captain from 2 counties over arrived with men who wore helmets that actually met standards. They went 30 yards in, just far enough to see the drift narrow and the rails begin to tilt toward a black curve, and came back out with their faces saying the part they would not until the press had left. You don't take civilians into places like that. Liability before love, and the measurements aren't yours to bargain with. The search pivoted to the hills and side gullies and old stone crop ruins where teenagers like to sit and pass a bottle. Helicopters flared the creek willows and rattled the tin roofs of the western edge of town. A volunteer brought horses that knew the difference between a cottonmouth and a rattler, and the difference between a human scent worth getting excited about and a coyote's. They found a scatter of beer cans that weren't the kids' brand, a scrap of denim bleached nearly white by sun, tracks that might have been theirs or might have been everyone's. They did not find 8. That first week, rumor made the rounds that someone had seen a white county truck up at Redbird that afternoon. Another rumor said a white pickup with a green stripe, the kind the state wildlife techs used, had been parked at the cattle guard where you turn west. Rumor said the driver of either had an argument with somebody young. Rumor said voices carried down the canyon like you were in a hallway when you weren't. Sheriff Eddington wrote it down the way a man does, who knows half of what you write down is good for nothing in the end, but doesn't dare skip any because you never know. Which half, by the following Sunday, the church bulletins asked people to remember the 8 without saying the word hope out loud, because you handle hope like a bird you want to release. Too tight, and it dies. Too loose, and it's gone before anyone gets to see the wing beat. The File grew. Interviews, maps with coloured pencil lines, a property card showing Redbird. Had been sold from a shell company to an LLC with a mailing address 3 counties away and a signature you couldn't decipher. A log sheet from Hanson's Market with a receipt tape proving egg salad and 2 bags of chips were purchased at 12:47 p.m. A note in the margin from Sarah's mother. Blue St. Christopher on silver chain. Because when you're accounting for a life, you count everything. Someone jotted, Denise left ring finger scar from the time she dropped a pan at the diner. Cade, front tooth chipped. Benji, brown cap, Oilers or... By August, the road dust had settled back into itself, and the creek sounded normal when it ran over stone. The case didn't go cold so much as it cooled to whatever you call the temperature a town lives at when it knows there are 8 names it can't say without watching older men look away. Sheriff Eddington kept the box in his office when he should have archived it. He would take the lid off sometimes and stare at the St. Christopher note and think about his own daughter walking out into the world in 2 years, and he would shut the lid and tell himself he'd call the state again tomorrow. 15 years is not something you count day by day. It accrues in small routine. Grocery lists, oil changes, school concerts. New people move in who don't know where Redbird even is on the ridge. Old people move away because a house where a room stays empty joint aches a person. The Whitcombs sold and went 2 towns over. The Goodwins stayed and potted geraniums in coffee cans the way women do when their hands need tasks. In 2008, the state sent letters to counties about Batgate compliance. White nose syndrome had started showing up in caves back east, and wherever there are old mines, there are often bats. Gates had to be installed or upgraded, steel that keeps people out and gives bats a door. The Redbird parcels were on the list, even though the county thought they were private. A clerical correction followed, the kind that spits out a new map with a different shading and makes a problem suddenly yours when yesterday it was not. So on a Tuesday in June, Dr. Nomi Adler, a wildlife biologist who had made peace with the fact that most of her work involved telling people, "No, you can't go in there," drove a dusty state rig up the Ore Road with a technician and an old man named Harlan Weeks, who knew more about the bowels of Redbird than any map. "I ran timber up here when your daddy was a boy," Harlan told her, not unkind, just to set scale. He wore his hard hat like a hat and called the drift a hole, no matter how many times Nomi said, "Add it." The mouth looked as it always had, quiet except for the breath of cold air. The padlock on the chain was a newer style, brass with a blue band. Nomi took her clipboard and marked "Needs Gate" and "Check for Bat Sign" and "Survey Venter." The 3 of them stood in the shade and listened, and at first they heard what anyone hears. Wind, a few bats tittering in sleep, drip somewhere deeper. Then Harlan cocked his head and said, "Hear that?" Nomi listened harder. It wasn't voices. It wasn't machines. It was a small sound she couldn't place at first, metallic against metal, like something loose inside a can when you shake it. She stepped to the edge of the dark, where the rails disappeared, and leaned closer. It came again, a gentler tinkle. "There," she said, and flicked her headlamp on. Light edged through 30 feet of cool and cut across a clutter of rock and old timber and something half buried at the line where dust turns to damp. Harlan slipped a boot over the chain and stepped down because old men do practical things before younger ones can talk about permits. He reached to the damp line and dug with his fingers, careful as if he expected a rattler. He came up with a small fist of clay with something pale showing through like a tooth. He rinsed it at the seep just inside and looked at it for a long breath before he handed it over to Nomi, the way men hand over newborns they're afraid to drop. It was a silver St. Christopher medallion on a broken chain. Blue enamel still bright under the mud. Nomi turned it in her palm and read the tiny letters engraved on the back by a jeweler who'd been dead a decade. "Olgi, we love you. Mom and Dad." She didn't know the name it belonged to. Harlan did. He said it as if saying it were a thing you're supposed to do in a place like this when a small piece of the past makes its way to light. "Lila Goodwin," he said. Lord, that girl always smiled at a fella like she expected the best. Nomi slid the medallion into a coin envelope and wrote the date and coordinates with a micro marker. Hands steady, because the body knows what to do when a job suddenly becomes something bigger than a job. Harlan put his palms on his thighs and exhaled through his nose. 15 years, he said, and the whole still talks. They could have come back the next day and followed protocol and never told anyone until the report was done. That's the professional way, but the valley is a place where news doesn't keep like milk in summer. Word moved faster than the truck did down the Orr Road. By supper time, Sheriff Eddington, older, slower, still with the box on his shelf, had the medallion in his hand, reading the engraving under the desk lamp like it was a love letter someone left for him to carry. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't in years. At dawn, the Goodwins stood with him at the pull-off, both hands on each other, because people who have been married 40 years know the things you hold on to when the ground tries to shift. Mrs. Goodwin pressed her mouth to the little saint and didn't make a sound. Mr. Goodwin looked past the chain into the dark and said, in a voice that had no anger left, only bone-deep asking, "What else is in there?" Nomi tucked her clipboard under her arm. "We'll do this right," she said, "and we won't stop at the first easy answer. Sheriff Eddington didn't say he should have said that 15 Junes ago. He said, we'll need a gate and a permit and people who know how to hear what rock's been keeping." And Harlan nodded like a man who can already feel which boards will split under a boot without looking. The mine had kept its secret a long time. Now it had handed over its first word, and the word had a name on it. The St. Christopher medallion didn't look like much under fluorescent lights at the sheriff's office. Just a thumb-sized oval, cheap silver, the kind you could buy at a roadside shop for $10. But in a town that had lived 15 years with silence, it was an earthquake. By midweek, people were parking on the Orr Road shoulder, leaning against pickups, waiting for updates the way you wait outside a delivery. Room. Old-timers who hadn't mentioned Redbird in years suddenly had theories again. The high schooler at the gas station swore his uncle knew a state cop who said the mine was about to give up everything. It felt, for the first time in years, like there might be a way to turn the clock back. Sheriff Walt Eddington didn't indulge the optimism. He held the medallion in an evidence bag, propped against the file box that never left his desk. That box was thick as a phone book now. Maps, interviews, sighting reports that led nowhere, a few Polaroids of the mine mouth. Walt called it his box of rumors because 90% of it was. He reread the first entries, dated July 1993. The initial interviews still stung him. So much chatter, so many distractions. One man had claimed he saw the 8 at a truck stop, an hour away, piling into a stranger's van. Another said they'd run away to California. He even had a name of a commune. A teenage girl swore she'd gotten a postcard in the mail with no return address, signed S. Sheriff Eddington had chased them all. He'd driven 3 hours to interview a gas station clerk who turned out to be drunk. He'd sent letters to postmasters in California towns so small they weren't on the map. Every lead fizzled. The one rumor that never left his mind was the white truck. 3 different witnesses had sworn to it. A white pickup with no plates parked near the cattle guard the afternoon the kids disappeared. Another insisted they saw a county road truck, same color, same body style, headed down the Orr Road just after sunset. One old miner claimed he heard engines inside Redbird, not kids fooling around, something bigger. No plate, no clear ID, no proof. The state investigators shrugged it off. Half the trucks in this valley are white, they'd told him, and every rumor grows. A tale after dark, but Walt kept those statements at the top of the file. And now, 15 years later, the mine had coughed up a medallion. That wasn't rumor, that was proof. The Goodwins were the first to come in. Lila's mother and father, grey now, shoulders bent from years of lifting a grief too heavy. They sat across from Walt at the same oak table he'd used since '93. Mrs. Goodwin touched the evidence bag with 2 fingers, as if afraid it might shatter. "It's hers," she whispered. "She never took it off." Walt nodded. "We'll have the lab confirm, but I wanted you to see it first." Mr. Goodwin kept his eyes on the table. 15 years, Sheriff. You told us then you'd find something. Why now? Walt had no good answer. Sometimes the earth keeps secrets. Sometimes it lets one go. He expected anger, but what he saw in their faces was worse. Tired acceptance. They weren't surprised the truth had stayed buried so long. They were only surprised the mine had given back anything at all. The other families trickled in over the next days. Denise's father, who still carried his daughter's high school photo in his wallet, creased and faded. Cade's older brother, bitter, who accused the sheriff flat out of incompetence. Sarah and Noah's parents, who had moved 2 towns over and hadn't set foot in Miller Hollow in a decade, but drove back the minute they heard. They all asked the same question: if the medallion was there, what else is? The state sent a mine safety team 2 weeks later. 4 men in hard hats, canisters on their belts, and an air of quiet authority. They strung yellow tape around the Redbird portal and put up signs. Authorized personnel only. Locals gathered behind. The tape anyway. Some were family, others were just curious. Old Harlan Weeks was there every day, leaning on his cane, telling anyone who would listen about bulkheads and vent doors and old workings that don't show on maps. The inspectors went in 30 yards, meter needles twitching. They came back out shaking their heads. Carbon monoxide levels spiked past safety. One man muttered, "Somebody ran a generator down there years ago. Poisoned the air." That made ears prick up. A generator meant people who weren't supposed to be there. The inspectors promised a report. Sheriff Eddington knew what that meant. A binder full of technical terms, mailed 6 weeks later, with recommendations that boiled down to too dangerous to explore further. But the medallion was already enough to pry open the case. The state couldn't just walk away. The families wouldn't let them. With the case back in the news, the old whispers returned. At the diner, men lowered their voices and said the kids had seen something they shouldn't. That maybe they'd stumbled on. People using Redbird for more than scrap copper, chemicals, shipments, storage. One woman swore her brother saw barrels being hauled up the ore road that summer. Others pointed higher. The county had paid contractors to seal old mine entrances in the early 90s. Maybe one of those jobs had gone wrong. Maybe someone had known the kids were inside and closed the drift anyway. The wildest rumor came from a retired deputy that the sheriff's office itself had ordered Redbird sealed in '93. Walt bristled when he heard it. He knew exactly what was in his file, every signature, every date, but rumor doesn't need proof, it only needs oxygen. And the valley was breathing heavy again. Walt sat late one night with the box on his desk. He flipped past interviews, maps, receipts. Then he saw a note he hadn't read in years. Work order number 74, August 93, Redbird North Portal, seal installation. Contractor R. Bledsoe. Approved by County Road Dept. He'd read it 100 times. But now, with the medallion on his desk, it pulsed like a live wire. Roy Bledsoe, welder. Known for odd jobs, cattle guards, culverts, patching up broken gates. The kind of man you called when the county didn't want to pay a big firm. He'd signed off on sealing Redbird 2 weeks after the kids disappeared. At the time, nobody thought twice. The state wanted unsafe shafts closed. Roy welded steel and poured concrete, case closed. But now Walt couldn't stop asking himself, what if the 8 had already been inside? What if that seal wasn't protection? It was a trap. The next morning, Walt drove out to the Bledsoe place. 15 years had changed it little. The same sagging trailer, the same shed stuffed with scrap metal under tarps. But the yard was quiet. No sign of Roy. His neighbor, an old woman hanging laundry, shuffled over. "You're too late, Sheriff. He went into hospice last winter. Cancer got him." Walt's stomach sank. If Roy had answers, they'd died with him. But then the neighbor added, "His boy cleaned out the shed, hauled boxes to the dump. I saw some papers in the burn barrel. Looked like maps, maybe. Drawings. Maps. Drawings." Walt felt the hair on his neck stand. He drove straight to the county landfill, asked for the last load from Bledsoe's place. The attendant squinted at him but pointed. The pile was half buried already, but after an hour of digging, in the stink and dust, Walt found a warped cardboard box. Inside, rusted tools, scrap notebooks, and one roll of yellowed drafting paper. On it, hand-sketched lines. Shafts, drifts, notes in a welder's handwriting. Bulkhead here, seal here, vent. Don't open. At the bottom corner, one word underlined twice. Redbird. Walt spread the maps on his desk that night. His heart pounded. There, plain as day, was a side drift labeled South Vent. A drift that didn't appear on any official map. A drift that angled toward the spot where the medallion had surfaced, and scrawled beside it in Roy's shaky hand, "Blocked. Foam. Temporary." Walt leaned back in his chair, throat tight. The valley had lived 15 years on rumors. But this was no rumor. This was a man's own record, saying he had sealed a vent, sealed it while 8 young people were missing. For the first time in years, Sheriff Eddington felt the weight of his box shift from paper to iron. And he knew that Redbird hadn't told its worst secret yet. The maps lay across Sheriff Eddington's desk like veins in a body. He kept tracing the penciled lines with his finger, drifting from the word Redbird down into the scrawled notes. Bulkhead here, vent there, blocked, foam, temporary. His gut told him that what Roy Bledsoe had called temporary might have been permanent for 8 kids who never came home. For 15 years, he had defended himself by saying there were no clues, no proof, no evidence to hang hope on. But now, with the medallion and these sketches, he could feel the floor tilt under his boots. If Roy had sealed a vent in 1993, had he known? Had he heard something and walked away? Or had he been told to? The valley was already whispering louder. Word of the maps leaked before Walt could even make copies. People stood at the counter of the diner trading theories like cards, and none of them kind. Roy blocked him in, someone said. He had to. Others shook their heads. You think a welder on county pay has that kind of power? No. Someone told him to. Someone bigger. The families who had lived 15 years in quiet mourning found themselves pushed into the glare of gossip again. Denise's father barked at a reporter who tried to shove a microphone under his chin. Layla's mother stopped going to the grocery store, asking a neighbor to pick up flour and coffee so she wouldn't have to endure the stares. Cade's brother wrote a letter to the editor accusing the county of burying the truth from day one. The state sent a new team, not inspectors this time, but investigators, men and women who carried boxes of equipment instead of clipboards. They unrolled fiber optic lines. They drilled holes in the hillside to test air. They set up fans to blow fresh oxygen into drifts that had been sour since the year Clinton was sworn in. Every day, trucks rumbled up the Ore Road, past the pull-off, where families parked in silence, watching, waiting. Sheriff Eddington stood by the portal more often than not, hat pulled low, answering the same questions from reporters with the same flat line. We're pursuing new leads. We'll share facts when we have facts. One fact came sooner than expected. In the pile of papers from Bledsoe's shed, tucked between welding receipts and notes about cattle guards, investigators found a carbon copy of a county invoice Dated August 1993, labor, welding, materials, rebar, mesh, cement, spray foam. Location, Redbird South Vent. Signed, R. Bledsoe. Countersigned, County Road Supervisor J. Connolly. Walt stared at the name. He knew Connolly. Everyone did. Retired. Now, living 3 streets over, a man who still shook hands outside church and told stories about fishing trips like nothing had ever weighed on him. The signature was neat and confident. Approval for work that happened weeks after the kids vanished. When the state investigators asked Connolly about it, he shrugged. He didn't deny the signature. He said sealing old shafts was routine. Said Redbird was a hazard. Said he hadn't thought of it in years. When asked whether he knew 8 young people were missing at the time, he looked startled, then irritated. "Of course I knew," he said. "But the mine's a labyrinth. Sealing. A vent isn't the same as sealing a body in. You don't know where those tunnels lead. I sure didn't." His words were reasonable, but his tone was off, too quick, too defensive. Sheriff Eddington, sitting in the corner of that interview room, felt a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. Meanwhile, the crews began probing deeper. For years, searchers had stopped 30 yards in, meters screaming warnings. Now, with fresh ventilation, they pushed further. They marked timbers with bright paint, mapped each side. Drift. At 70 yards, they found the first bulkhead Roy had noted, a concrete wall poured rough, smeared with expanding foam. Steel straps bolted into the rock. The team tested it, solid but not company standard. The foam was the cheap variety sold at hardware stores in 1993. The wall was man-made, unauthorized, built quickly, built by someone like Roy. On its face were faint scratches, as if boots or hands had brushed against it long ago. The families gathered behind tape when word leaked out. Reporters snapped pictures of them holding onto one another, faces pale in the morning light. The investigators photographed the wall, chipped samples, drilled for air. What came through was foul, stale, sour, dangerous. But it moved. Movement meant void beyond. A space cut off, sealed, preserved. The state authorized a controlled breach. Workers drilled, inserted a probe. A camera fed back grainy footage. Rock, timbers, collapsed rubble. And there, caught in the beam, something fabric. Faded blue cloth, edge stitched like denim. Sheriff Eddington closed his eyes when he saw it. The valley had been waiting 15 years for proof that the 8 were in there. Now proof was clawing its way back through a hole the size of a coin. They shut the feed off, not out of cruelty, but to preserve what was left. Protocol meant slow work, careful extraction, safety above all. But the families didn't hear protocol, they heard delay. At the next town meeting, voices rose. Sarah and Noah's father demanded action. "Don't tell me about safety," he said. "My kids died waiting for someone to be brave." Lila's mother sobbed openly. Cade's brother shouted about lawsuits. Sheriff Eddington stood at the podium, shoulders stooped, and said the only words he could. "We will bring them out, but we will do it right." That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through his house, past the wall where his daughter's photo hung. She was grown now, living 3 states away, safe. He thought of the families who had no such comfort. He thought of the white truck rumor, of Roy's foam, of Connolly's smooth denial. He thought of the denim scrap on the probe camera, cloth that should have been worn to dust long ago, but had been waiting, sealed away, in a dark pocket of the mountain. 2 weeks later, the breach widened enough for a man to squeeze through. And an investigator named Collins wriggled in with an air monitor clipped to his chest and a camera strapped to his helmet. The feed played live in a trailer outside, where Walt, the families, and the state team huddled in silence. Collins's light cut across rock and timber, across collapsed beams, across a space no human had entered in 15 years. The camera swung and froze. Against the far wall lay a boot. Old, leather cracked, laces gone, and above it, In the dust, the faint outline of a handprint smeared in something darker than dirt. Mrs. Goodwin gasped. Denise's father clutched the table. Sheriff Eddington steadied himself on the chair back. Collins's voice crackled in their ears. "We've got human remains." The trailer filled with the sound of grief that had been waiting too long. Some sobbed. Some sat stone-faced, finally hearing what they had known all along. Walt pressed his palm against the wall of the trailer as though he could steady the whole room by touch. 15 years of rumors had just become fact, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew the mine hadn't given up all its secrets. A boot and a handprint didn't explain a white truck. They didn't explain why a county work order had sealed the vent after the kids vanished. They didn't explain why Roy Bledsoe had written the word temporary on a map he never showed another soul. And until those questions were answered, Redbird would keep whispering. The first recovery team went in on a Friday morning, wearing full respirators and moving like men walking through a cathedral, each step measured, each word spoken low. They built a frame around the breached wall, shored the timbers, and widened the opening until they could pass stretchers through. The air inside was still sour even after weeks of venting. Every move was catalogued, recorded, bagged, because the difference between rumor and history is paperwork, and these families deserved history. The boot that Collins had spotted belonged to a body curled against a collapsed timber. Male, late teens to early 20s. The remains were fragile, more shadow than substance, but in the pocket of the jeans was a wallet, leather stiff as bark. Inside, a laminated library card with the name Cade Ransom. The news travelled before. The body even made it to the coroner's van. At the pull-off, Cade's brother dropped to his knees in the dust, clutching the fence post like it might hold him upright. People whispered prayers. Others looked at the mountain and swore under their breath. Behind Cade, deeper in the sealed section, lay more. The second body, wedged in a corner, was wearing a denim jacket with a patch half hanging off the sleeve. Sarah Whitcomb's mother recognized it the moment she saw the photograph. She had sewn that patch back on twice in high school. When the coroner confirmed the bone measurements matched a young woman, the identification was certain enough. Sarah had been 15 feet from Cade, trapped in the same dead pocket of air. The discovery of two should have brought relief, but it only stoked anger. If they were here, if the others were deeper, then the county had sealed 8 lives behind a wall and walked away. The questions roared louder than the grief. Who ordered Roy Bledsoe to pour that wall? Why was it signed off after the disappearance? Why had it taken 15 years for the truth to breathe again? Sheriff Eddington sat at his desk with the box of files and the new reports stacked beside it. He rubbed his temples until the skin burned. In all his years in uniform, he had never felt the ground so uncertain beneath him. He had known Roy as a welder, a man who kept to himself, the kind of worker the county used when they wanted a cheap job done fast. But Connolly, the road supervisor, had signed that order. Connolly had to have known. Walt found himself on Connolly's porch one evening, hat in hand, asking questions he already knew wouldn't be answered. Connolly leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a cigarette burning down between 2 fingers. "We sealed dozens of holes that summer," he said flatly. "Redbird was one of them. Nobody knew those kids went in. If they did, it was their own foolishness. Don't put that on me." His voice had the edge of a man rehearsed, like he'd said those words in his head for years, waiting for the day they'd be needed. Walt pressed harder. The order was August. They'd been missing for a month. "You're telling me you thought sealing a vent no one had looked into was routine?" Connolly didn't flinch. He tapped his cigarette into a flower pot. "Sheriff, sometimes routine is the only way you get through a day." And then he closed the door with a finality that told Walt no more would be said. The families were told the work would continue slowly, carefully. But slow and careful felt like betrayal after 15 years of waiting. A group of them marched into the county courthouse demanding answers. Denise's father shouted until his throat went raw. They sealed my daughter in like she was trash. Who gave that order? County commissioners promised an independent inquiry. The promise rang hollow. Nobody trusted county promises anymore. Back at Redbird, the team uncovered another clue. In the rubble near Sarah's body, buried under rock dust, was a notebook. Pages fused, cover rotted. But inside, a name still legible in faded ink, Noah Whitcomb. The writing was smudged, water-warped, but one line on the back page cut through. The years, ere wrong. Don't trust the door. Sheriff Eddington stared at it under the evidence light, the words like a hand reaching out of the past. Don't trust the door. Which door? The bulkhead Roy built? Or something else deeper inside? The mine maps Roy left hinted at more than one sealed section. There was the bulkhead already breached, but further down, another mark, a second wall, drawn heavier, annotated with the words South Vent Block. If the first bulkhead had trapped Cade and Sarah, what lay behind the second? The investigators prepared a plan. But news of Noah's notebook leaked, and the phrase, "Don't trust the door," became a kind of chant in town. It was painted on cardboard, signs outside the courthouse. It was murmured in the diner booths, where rumors fermented. People no longer saw Redbird as just a mine. They saw it as a tomb deliberately made, and every official who had ever signed a line on paper was suspect. One night, Walt drove up the ore road alone. He sat in his truck by the pull-off, engine off, listening to the mountain breathe. He thought about resigning, thought about handing the case to someone younger, someone without 15 years of ghosts on his shoulders. But he couldn't. The valley didn't trust anyone else, not really. The families still came to him, not the statemen with their fans and cameras. Him, the man who had failed them in 1993 but was still here, still digging, still carrying their names like stones in his pockets. When the team breached the second wall, the air that spilled out was colder, heavier, as if it had been pressed down for years. Their lights cut into a chamber larger than the first, timbers still holding, rails vanishing into the dark. And there, at the edge of the beam, something glittered faintly. A ring, gold band, small, bent out of shape, pressed into the dust. One of the investigators lifted it with gloved hands. Inside the band, tiny letters etched, Benji to Tori, forever. The ring was proof of presence, proof of love carried into the dark, but it was also proof that more bodies waited inside, and with it came another question. If Benji and Tori lay deeper in, had all 8 been herded, sealed, trapped, or had some found another way, another pocket of air, another door that still waited to be opened? That night, as the families gathered in the gymnasium for a briefing, Walt stood at the front, hat in hand. He told them what they had found. Cade, Sarah, Noah's notebook, Benji's ring. He told them the work would continue, careful, methodical, and he promised them again that he would not stop until every secret Redbird held was brought into the light. But in his heart, he knew the hardest part was still ahead, because the deeper they went, the clearer it became that someone had chosen to close those doors. Someone had made Redbird into a grave, and the question that no one dared ask out loud yet was this: had the 8 ever had a chance to get out at all, or had they been sealed in alive? The chamber behind the second wall gave the crews more than dust and debris. In the far corner, where the rock had sloped into a natural depression, they found a thermos lying on its side, enamel chipped but intact. Scratched into the paint with something sharp were 3 letters, Den. Denise Mercado had signed her name in that thermos with desperate force. The investigators bagged it and passed it into Sheriff Eddington's hands, and for a moment the old sheriff had to turn his face away from the families waiting at the fence. The objects that surfaced weren't just relics anymore. They were proof of survival, proof of fear, proof that someone had been alive long enough to carve letters and scroll notes. The forensic reports started to build a picture. The timbers of the second wall had been cut with a powered saw, not hand tools. The foam sealant used to fill the gaps had chemical markers traced back to a batch manufactured in mid-1993, shipped to local hardware stores. The receipts from those stores showed purchases of multiple cans charged to county accounts. Walt sat at his desk, staring at the copies. County funds, county signature, county man with a welder's torch. And 8 young people who never walked, back down the ore road. He tried to tell himself again that it might have been accident, bad timing, ignorance, but the thermos and the notebook and the scratches in the concrete told a harsher story. The kids had been alive when those walls went up. They had pounded, carved, written, pleaded. Someone had heard or known and had still sealed. The town meetings turned heated. Reporters crowded the gym, asking whether the county was responsible for negligent homicide. Denise's father slammed, his fist on the table. "Don't tell me about negligence. Someone locked that door knowing my daughter was inside." The commissioners deflected. The state officials used words like protocol and procedure. None of it mattered. The valley was beginning to believe what nobody had said out loud for 15 years. This wasn't tragedy alone. This was crime. The deeper the teams went, the more the mine seemed to confirm it. Near the rails, they found a coil of nylon rope, cut clean, its frayed end seared as if sliced by a tool. They found a lantern, long extinguished, its glass still smeared with fingerprints. And then they found the third body, Tory Lane, identified by dental records, her engagement ring still on her finger. The stone was dulled by dust, but the band bore Benji's initials. She had been lying near a collapsed timber, her arm outstretched, as if reaching for something just out of sight. For the families, each discovery was a new wound. Tory's mother fainted when she saw the ring. Benji's father wept openly in the sheriff's office, repeating the same phrase, "I told him. To stay away from there, I told him," until his voice was gone. For Walt, each recovery was a weight pressing harder on his chest. He had been sheriff when they vanished. He had signed off on those early reports, listened to rumors, chosen not to push past dangerous readings. He carried that guilt like a brand, and now the evidence was burning it deeper. The investigators kept returning to one question. Why would Roy Bledsoe build not one, but 2 walls? His maps showed them both. His receipts confirmed the materials. He had worked for the county, but why seal more than once unless someone told him what needed to be hidden? The man was dead now, beyond interview, beyond cross-examination. But his silence was beginning to sound like a confession. Walt drove to see Roy's son, a man in his 40s who lived 2 towns over. He found him on a back porch, beer in hand, wary eyes. "I don't know nothing about my father's jobs," the son said before Walt had even sat down. He kept his work to himself, didn't talk about the mines. Walt nodded, let the silence hang. The son shifted in his chair, but he was scared those last years. Wouldn't drive up the ridge, wouldn't even go past the cattle guard. He said once, "There are things under that mountain I wish I'd never touched." That's all he gave me. And I didn't ask more. The sheriff thanked him, left, but the words stayed in his ears. Things under that mountain. Wishes he'd never touched. Back in town, the rumor mill chewed faster. Some said drugs had been hidden in Redbird, that the kids had stumbled onto smugglers. Others said toxic waste barrels had been stored, chemicals the county didn't want to pay to dispose of, and the kids had seen them. A few whispered darker that someone inside law enforcement had ordered the seal to bury witnesses as much as to bury hazards. In the diner booths, people lowered their voices when Walt walked in. He felt their eyes on his back when he left. He knew what they thought, that he had been part of it, that his failure was too convenient to be just failure. The truth, he feared, might not be so neat. It might not be one villain in a white truck or a single county man with a torch. It might Be layers of negligence and selfish choices stacked until they became a coffin. But the notebook scrawl, the thermos scratch, the rope cut, it all suggested intent. Someone had made decisions that cost 8 lives. As the crews widened the second chamber, they found more. Near the timbers was a pile of objects that seemed to have been gathered together, as if the kids had tried to create a cache. 2 empty soda cans, a guitar pick, a cracked flashlight, a St. Christopher charm missing its chain. Lila's charm, the twin to the medallion found at the vent, the second piece of her necklace kept here, meant she had made it this far. But she hadn't gotten out. That night, Walt sat at his desk long after the office closed. He laid out the evidence, the medallion, the notebook, the thermos, the rope, the ring. Each object was a voice, speaking through 15 years of silence. And each voice asked the same question: why did nobody open the door? He thought of Connolly again, the road supervisor with his 2 smooth denials. He thought of Roy's maps, labeled temporary. He thought of the white truck rumors, never proven, always dismissed. What if that truck had carried materials? What if someone else had been there when the kids were still alive? The mine was nearly ready for a third breach. The investigators had mapped a narrow crosscut leading deeper to another marked wall on Roy's sketches. They planned to open it within a week. Walt knew what they would find: more bones, more objects, more proof. But what haunted him wasn't just the recoveries, it was the possibility that somewhere, in some forgotten crevice, might be the final note, the last words written by one of the 8, preserved in dark air. The families were gathering. Strength. Lawyers had begun circling. The county commissioners met behind closed doors, emerging pale and defensive. Reporters from outside the state arrived, hungry for the story of a mine that had swallowed 8 and a county that had sealed the lid. The valley was no longer just grieving, it was angry. On a Monday morning, as crews prepared equipment, a deputy came into Walt's office holding a small evidence bag. Found it wedged in a timber near the second wall, he said. Walt took it, held it to the light. Inside was a cigarette butt, filter yellowed, brand name visible. Not the kind the kids had smoked. The state lab confirmed the manufacture date, mid-1993. Walt's throat tightened. Someone had stood at that wall with a lit cigarette while the 8 were inside. Someone had leaned against the timber, taken a drag, dropped the butt, and walked away. Walt sat heavily in his chair, the butt pinched between his fingers through plastic. It wasn't negligence anymore, it was presence. Proof that someone had been there, sealing, smoking, listening to the faint hammer of fists on the other side. The next breach would tell them more. But for the first time in 15 years, Walt was certain of one thing. The 8 hadn't just vanished into a mountain. They had been buried alive, and someone had made the choice to walk away while smoke curled from his lips. The cigarette butt sat on Sheriff Eddington's desk like a curse. For days, he turned it over in his mind, imagining the hand that had held it, the lips that had drawn smoke, the ears that must have heard the muffled pounding of fists on the other side of the wall. Whoever had smoked that cigarette had been alive, calm, working, while 8 young people fought for air in the dark. Walt carried the evidence bag with him in his jacket pocket, as if keeping it close would stop the memories from slipping further into rumor. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was flesh and blood proof that someone had been there. The state crews prepared for the third breach with a care that felt almost ritual. They reinforced the drift leading in, erected fresh braces, pumped air for days. Families were told again to stay behind the tape, but by now they came anyway, setting up lawn chairs in the dirt, waiting from sunrise until dusk. Some prayed aloud. Others just stared at the mountain with hollow eyes. The news vans parked further down, satellites pointed skyward, reporters rehearsing lines about tragedy, cover-up, and justice. When the crew finally cut into the third wall, the air that escaped was heavier still, rich with the weight of years. The fans roared, monitors beeped, and then the cameras went in. What they found inside was not another cramped pocket like before, but a chamber large enough to hold a truck. Rusted timbers sagged, rails disappeared under rubble, and against the far wall, in the circle of the beam, lay a cluster of bones. Not scattered, not collapsed. Together, as if 8 kids had huddled close, waiting. The recovery was methodical, agonizingly slow. Each bone tagged, each scrap of cloth photographed. A denim jacket sleeve, a torn flannel shirt, a sneaker with the sole half peeled. One by one, the bodies were identified through the fragments left. Ethan Crowell by his dental work. Lila Goodwin by a tiny silver hair clip still clasped in a lock of hair that had somehow survived. Benji Cross by a belt buckle he had tooled himself in shop class. Denise Mercado by the remnants of a bracelet she had braided from yarn. And then, in the middle of the chamber, under a fallen timber, they found Noah Whitcomb's body. Beside him, clutched to his chest, was a small spiral notebook, edges warped, but pages still legible. He had written until the very end. The entries were short, fading, scrawled with a hand unsteady from lack of air. The last page carried only 2 words, pressed so deep into the paper the pencil tore. Still here. When Sheriff Eddington read those words, he pressed the notebook to his forehead and closed his eyes. The families would have to see them, would have to know, but for one moment he wanted them only to himself. A last whisper from a boy who had trusted him once. The forensic team catalogued the chamber with clinical precision, but the story was already clear. The 8 had been alive when the walls went up. They had survived for hours, maybe longer, together in that chamber, fighting for air. They had written, scratched, carved, clung to each other, and someone outside had smoked a cigarette, leaned against a timber, and sealed them in. The county scrambled to distance itself. The commissioners called emergency meetings, issued statements about tragic oversights. The road supervisor, Connolly, gave another interview, denying knowledge, insisting he had only signed off on routine closures. If Bledsoe did more than he was told, that's on him, Connolly said. But the cigarette butt, the maps, the invoices, none of them were on Roy alone. They were county work, county signatures, county money. The families weren't interested in bureaucratic dodge. They wanted truth. They wanted names. Denise's father shouted at a press conference until deputies led him out. "They buried my daughter alive. You knew, you signed, you let it happen." His words echoed off the courthouse walls, and even those who had once avoided the subject found themselves unable to look away now. Walt found himself visiting the mine alone at night, headlights off, truck parked on the shoulder. He'd sit with the window down, listening to the wind slide down the ore road. He thought of Noah's words, "Still here," and wondered if they were meant as a message for the future or simply a stubborn refusal to let go. Either way, they would haunt him. The forensic lab returned results on the cigarette. DNA degraded, but not gone. Male profile not matching any of the 8. Sheriff Eddington carried that report into his office and laid it on the desk beside the notebook and the ring and the thermos. Proof. Tangible proof that another man had been present. A man still alive, perhaps still living in the valley. He knew what that meant. It meant this was no longer only a recovery. It was a criminal case. The FBI arrived within the week, brought in after national media picked up the story. They wanted files, maps, every note Walt had scribbled in the margins 15 years ago. They wanted to know about the white truck, about Connolly, about Bledsoe's contracts. Walt handed it all over, but he kept the cigarette butt in his pocket. Some evidence you don't give up, not until you're sure the people holding it will understand its weight. The families buried what could be buried. 8 caskets lined up in the gymnasium, though some held only fragments. The pastor spoke of faith, of justice, of rest, but the faces in the pews were hard. They weren't ready for rest. They wanted accountability, As the service ended, Sarah's father leaned toward Walt and whispered, "Don't let them file this away again. Don't let them tell us closure is enough." Walt gripped his hand and promised. It was all he could do. The FBI's first move was to dig deeper into county records. They found invoices for concrete, steel, foam, all purchased in July and August 1993, all charged to Redbird projects. They subpoenaed old payroll logs. Names surfaced, men who had worked alongside Bledsoe, men who had driven trucks up the ore road. Most denied memory. Some claimed they had just hauled supplies. A few admitted they had heard voices in the mine when they went to work, but said they assumed it was echoes, kids fooling around. None had stopped. None had opened a door. One name appeared again and again, a foreman named Randall Pierce, who had overseen several closures that summer. Pierce had retired to Arizona years ago, but neighbors remembered him bragging once that Redbird was the easiest job I ever had. Just block it off and move on. When FBI agents knocked on his door, he refused to answer questions, lawyered up. But his silence was louder than words. Sheriff Eddington watched the news unfold from the edge of town, sitting in his truck, listening to the mine breathe through the vents the crews had finally reopened. He knew the story wasn't finished. The FBI could name names, indict officials, publish reports, but none of it would change the simple fact that 8 kids had walked into Redbird on a Saturday afternoon and had been left behind a wall while the world moved on. The third chamber had given back their bones, their objects, their last words. But Walt suspected it still held one more truth. The maps showed one final crosscut, a narrow side drift, unsealed but marked in Roy's shaky hand. Don't enter. What waited there was anyone's guess. Another dead end, another cache. Or perhaps the final piece that explained why the 8 had never found their way out. As the crews prepared to explore that drift, Walt stood at the mouth of the mine and pressed the notebook to his chest. He whispered to the dark, as if the mountain might finally answer, "We're still here too, and we're not done." The drift Roy had scrawled, "Don't enter," was narrower than the others, sloping down into rock that smelled of wet rust and old oil. The engineers hesitated at first, wanting to brace every yard before anyone set foot inside, but the families pressed harder now. They wanted answers, not just remains. 15 years of waiting had burned away patience. Sheriff Eddington stood beside them, jaw set. He knew whatever lay inside that last drift would either explain everything or finish breaking the valley apart. The breach was cut carefully, timbers installed, fans pushing fresh air. A camera was sent first. The feed showed a low tunnel, 20 yards long, ending in a chamber not natural but shaped by hands and machines. When the team went in, their lights found rows of rusted steel drums stacked 3 high, labels flaking but still legible. Hazardous waste, solvent. Dozens of them, hidden in a place no state inspector had ever charted. Some had burst long ago, their contents dried to dark crust on the stone floor. Others remained sealed, heavy and toxic. The discovery shifted the story instantly. The families, suspicions, the rumors whispered for years. It was all true. Redbird hadn't just been a tomb. It'd been a dump, a hiding place for barrels the county hadn't wanted to pay to ship out. And the 8 kids, laughing and curious that Saturday, had walked into the middle of it. They had seen the drums, maybe even touched them, maybe joked about the warning labels, and that had been enough to seal their fate. The FBI traced the trail quickly. County invoices showed contracts with a waste disposal company that never existed, signatures approving payments to accounts that led nowhere. Someone had been pocketing the difference, cutting corners, burying the danger in Redbird, trusting the mountain to keep the secret. When the kids stumbled on it, the plan changed. Seal the drifts, shut the doors, pretend they'd run away. Let the valley move on. Names emerged. Connolly, the road supervisor, Pierce, the foreman, at least 2 commissioners who had signed budgets without questions, and Bledsoe, the welder, the man who'd done the work with his own hands. Some were dead now, beyond trial. Others were old men, pale and trembling in courtrooms where families finally shouted their questions across the aisle. Why? They demanded. Why not call for help? Why not pull them out? The answers never came. The lawyers spoke of protocol, of lack of evidence, of different times. But the truth was written in every artifact pulled from the mine. They had been alive, they had begged, and someone had walked away. The cigarette butt came back into the story then. DNA testing identified it as Randall Pierce's. The foreman, the man who had overseen the sealing, the one who had laughed years later about Redbird being the easiest job he'd ever had. He had stood there, smoking, while Noah scrawled still here in his notebook. He had heard their fists. He had dropped ash on the floor. And then he had told the welder to finish the wall. The trial was brief. Pierce was too sick to sit through. Most of it, his lawyer speaking for him. But the jury only needed to see the notebook, the thermos, the map, the cigarette. Guilty on counts of manslaughter, negligent homicide, conspiracy. The families wept when the verdict was read, not because it brought relief, but because it proved what they had known all along. Their children hadn't been foolish wanderers or runaways. They had been silenced. When the sentence was handed down, life in prison without parole, Denise's father stood in the courtroom and said, voice shaking, "You gave yourself life, and you gave them death." Now the balance is set. The county itself faced lawsuits that drained its coffers. Settlements were paid, though no sum could cover the cost of 15 years of silence. The commissioners resigned. The courthouse flag hung half-mast, not for mourning, but for shame. Miller Hollow carried that shame like a scar, knowing its own officials had traded lives for money and quiet. The Redbird mine was sealed again, this time properly, after the barrels were hauled out under federal supervision. Trucks with hazmat placards rumbled down the ore road one by one, each drum accounted for, each manifest signed in triplicate. But before the final gate was welded shut, the families were allowed inside. They walked together to the chamber where the 8 had huddled. They placed flowers in the dust, photographs propped against the timbers, whispered their children's names aloud. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with memory. At the memorial service, 8 caskets stood side by side, draped with quilts sewn by women from 3 counties. The pastor spoke of faith, of loss, of justice, but the words that stayed came from Sarah and Noah's mother. She stood at the lectern, hands trembling, and said, "They told us for years to move on, but our children never moved on. They stayed in that dark, waiting for us to listen. And now, finally, we have." Sheriff Eddington retired soon after. He spent his last days in uniform, visiting each family, offering what little comfort he could. He had carried the guilt for 15 years and would carry it for the rest of his life, but he had kept his promise in the end. The 8 were no longer just names in a file box. They were stories, voices, remembered. The valley built a memorial. At the mouth of Redbird, 8 names carved into stone, a circle of benches where people could sit and hear the wind in the trees. On summer evenings, you could hear children playing nearby, their laughter bouncing off the ridges. And sometimes, if you stood close enough, you could almost hear another sound, faint but steady, like the echo of pencils scratching on paper. Still, here, the words were carved into the stone below the names, so the next generation would never forget that the silence of the mountain had once been filled with voices. The families carried on, scarred but unbroken. The mine was gone, the lies exposed, but their children lived on in memory, in photographs, in the weight of a community that finally faced its own ghosts. And when strangers stopped at the memorial and asked what had happened here, the locals would answer simply, "They vanished," and for 15 years no one listened. But when the mountain finally spoke, we listened, and we will never stop listening. The story closed, not with relief, but with resolve. Because the truth of Redbird wasn't only about 8 young people sealed in the dark. It was about the danger of silence, the cost of looking away, the crime of choosing convenience over compassion. The mountain had given them back, and the valley at last had given them justice.